And with that thumb, what do you expect the poor guy to do? I added. They all looked at me, particularly Helena Thompson, lowered a mean gaze on my flesh. It wasn't anything but a sewing circle, and at the center of it was the culprit, Neil. Responsible perhaps for everything that was wrong. I looked out the window at the buzzing night street of Mission. I wanted to get going and hear the great jazz of Frisco. And remember, this was only my second night in town. Everything had happened a heap. I think Luann was very wise leaving you, Neil. For years now, you haven't any sense of responsibility for anyone. You've done so many awful things, I don't know what to say to you. And in fact, that was the point. And they all just sat around looking at Neil with lowered and hating eyes, and he giggled. He made a little dance. His bandage was getting dirtier all the time. It began to flop and unroll, and I suddenly realized that Neil was, by virtue of his enormous series of sins, becoming the idiot, the imbecile, the saint of the lot. You have absolutely no regard for anybody but yourself and your damned kicks. All you think about is what's hanging between your legs and how much money or fun you can get out of people, and then you just throw them aside. Not only that, but you're silly about it. It never occurs to you that life is serious and there are people trying to make something decent out of it instead of just goofing all the time, and that's what Neil was, the holy goof. Carolyn is crying her heart out tonight. Don't think for a minute that she wants you back. She said she never wanted to see you again, and she said it was going to be final this time. Yet you stand here and make silly faces, and I don't think there's a care in your heart. That was not true. I knew better, and I could have told them all right there. I didn't see any sense in trying it. These accusations were the same that had been leveled at me many a time in my own life on the East. I longed to go and put my arm around Neil and say, now look here, all of you. Remember just one thing. This guy has troubles too. And another thing, he never complains. And he's given all of you damned good time, just being himself. And if that wasn't enough for you, then send him to the firing squad. That's apparently what you're inching to do anyway. Nevertheless, Helen Hinkle was the only one in the gang who wasn't afraid of Neil and who could sit there calmly with her face hanging out, telling him, off in front of everybody. There were earlier days in Denver when Neil had everybody sit in the dark with their girls and just talked and talked and talked with a voice that was once hypnotic and strange and was said to make all the girls come across by sheer force of persuasion and the content of what he said. This was when he was 15, 16. Now his disciples were married, and the wives of his disciples had him on the carpet for the sexuality and the life he had helped burgeon. This may be a little thick. I listened further. Now you're going east with Jack, and what do you think you're going to accomplish by that? Carolyn has to stay home and mind the baby. Now you're gone. How can she keep her dentist job? And she never wants to see you again, and I don't blame her. If you see Al along the road, you tell him to come back to me or I'll kill him. Just as flat as that. It was the saddest and sweetest night. Then a complete silence fell over everybody, and when once Neil would have talked his way out, he just fell silent himself, but standing in front of everybody in full sight, ragged and broken and idiotic, right under the light bulbs, his bony face covered with sweat, throbbing veins, saying yes, 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 as though tremendous revelations were pouring into him all the time now. And I'm convinced they were, and the others suspected as much and were frightened. What was he knowing? He tried in all his power to tell me what he was knowing. And they envied that about me, my position at his side, defending him and drinking him in as they once tried to do. Then they looked at me. What was I? A stranger doing on the West Coast this fair night. I recoiled from the thought. We're going to Italy, I said. I washed my hands of the whole matter. Then, too, there was a strange air of maternal satisfaction in the air, for the girls were really looking at Neil like a mother looks at her dearest and most errant child, And he, with his sad thumb and all his revelations, knew it well. And that was why he was able, in breathless silence, to get up from the chair, stand a moment, and walk out of the apartment without a word to wait for us downstairs as soon as we'd made up our minds about time. This was what we sensed about the ghost on the sidewalk. I looked out the window. He was alone in the doorway, digging the street. Bitterness, recriminations, advice, morality, sadness. It was all behind him, and ahead of him was the ragged and ecstatic joy of pure being. Come on, Helen, Julie, let's go hit the jazz joints and forget it. Neil will be dead someday. Then what can you say to him? The sooner he's dead, the better, said Helen. And she spoke officially for almost everyone in the room. Very well, then, I said. But now he's alive. And I'll bet you want to know what he does next. And that's because he's got the secret that we're all busting out to find. And he's got splitting his head wide open. And if he goes mad, don't worry, it won't be your fault, but the fault of God. They objected to this. They said I really didn't know Neil. They said he was the worst scoundrel that ever lived, and I'd find out someday. To my regret, I was amused to hear them protest so much. Bill Thompson rose to the defense of the ladies and said he knew Neil better than anyone. And Neil was just a very interesting and even amusing con man. And but that was a bit too thick for me, because if you're going to be respectable, be so. And if not, don't be so. And make no halfway bones about it. And this, I sought to say, it was a dig at their shoddy routines and cons, past and present, which fortunately they didn't get. And where did I stand but on the verge of the moon? Why talk? I went out to find Neil. We had a brief talk about it. Man, don't worry. Everything is perfect and fine. He was rubbing his belly and licking his lips. The girls came down and we started out on our big night once more, pushing the car down the street till we had it running so fast it got away from us. And the girls didn't come back till they hailed a car, willing to push them back to us, wandering around, laughing in the dark. Whew, let's go, cried Neil. And we jumped in the back seat and clanked it to Howard Street, meanwhile hiding so the fellows who were pushing the girls and had come around the corner to find them again would push us all the way to Howard Street, thinking they had a chance for dates. They were disappointed when the motor started up and Julie made a few fast turns and got us to Howard Street, minus the boys. Out we jumped into the warm, mad night, hearing a wild tenorman bawling horn across the way, "Ee-yah, ee-yah, ee-yah," and hands clapping to the beat and folks yelling, "Go, go, go," far from escorting the girls into the place. Neil was already racing across the street with his thumb in the air, yelling, "Blow, man, blow!" A bunch of colored men, Saturday night suits, were whooping it up in front. It was a sawdust saloon, all wood, with a small bandstand near the john on which the fellows huddled with their hats on, blowing over people's heads. A crazy place. Not so far from Market Street, in the dingy back of it, near Mission and the Big Bridge Causeway. Crazy, floppy women wandered around, sometimes in their bathrobes. Bottles clanked in the alley. In the back of the joint, in a dark corridor, beyond the splattered toilets, scores of men and women stood against the wall drinking wine, Bali Ali, and spitting at the stars. The behatted tenorman was blowing at the peak of wonderfully satisfactory free ideas, a rising and falling riff that went from ee-ah to ee-diddly-ah, and blasted along to the rolling crash of butt-scarred drums hammered by a big, brutal man with a bull neck who didn't give a damn about anything but punishing his tubs. Crash, rattle, boom, crash, uproars of music, and the tenorman had it, and everybody knew he had it. Neil was clutching his head in the crowd, and it was a mad crowd. They were all urging that tenorman to hold it up and keep it with cries and wild eyes, and he was raising himself from a crouch and going down again with his horn, looping it up in a clear cry above the furor, and a 6-foot skinny Negro woman was rolling her bones at the man's horn bell, and he just jabbed it at her. E-e-e! He had a foghorn tone. His horn was taped. He had a shipyard worker, and he didn't care. He was a shipyard worker, and he didn't care. Everybody was rocking and roaring, and Helen and Julie, with beer in their hands, were standing on their chairs, shaking and jumping. Groups of guys stumbled in front from the street, crawling over each other to get there. "Stay with it, man," roared a man with a foghorn voice and let out a big groan that must have been heard clear out in Sacramento. "Ah, ooh," said Neil. He was rubbing his chest, his belly. The sweat splashed from his face. Boom, kick. That drummer was kicking his drums down the cellar and rolling the beat upstairs with his murderous sticks. Rattle-de-boom. A big fat man was jumping on the platform, making it sag and creak. Yo! The pianist was only pounding the keys with spread-eagled fingers, chords at intervals. When the great tenorman was drawing breath from another blast, Chinese chords, shuddering the piano in every timbre, chink and wire, boing. The tenorman jumped down from the platform and just stood in the crowd, blowing around. His hat was over his eyes. Somebody pushed it back for him. He just hauled back and stamped his feet and blew down a hoarse bawing blast and drew a breath and raised the horn and blew high wide and screaming in the air. Neil was directly in front of him with his face lowered to the bell of the horn, clapping his hands, pouring sweat on the man's keys, and the man noticed and laughed in his horn, a long, quivery, crazy laugh, and everybody else laughed. And they rocked, and finally the tenorman decided to blow his top and crouched down and held a note in high C for a long time as everything else crashed, along with the cries, increased. And I thought the cops would be coming for swarming from the nearest precinct. It was just a usual Saturday night good time, nothing else. The clock on the wall quivered and shook. Nobody cared about that thing. Neil was in a trance. The tenorman's eyes were fixed straight on him. He had found a madman who not only understood but cared and wanted to understand more and much more than there was, and they began dueling for this. Everything came out of the horn. No more phrases, just cries. Bah! And down to beep, and up to E, and down to clinkers, and over to sideways, echoing, horn sounds. He tried everything up, down, sideways, upside down, horizontal, 30 degrees, 40 degrees, and finally he fell back in somebody's arms and gave up, and everybody pushed and yelled, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, he blowed that one." Neil wiped himself off with his handkerchief. Then up stepped Freddie on the bandstand and asked for a slow beat and looked sadly out the open door over people's heads and began singing, "Close Your Eyes." Things quieted down for a minute. Freddie wore a tattered suede jacket, a purple shirt, cracked shoes, and zoot pants without press. He didn't care. He looked like Hunky. His big brown eyes were concerned with sadness and the singing of songs, slowly with long, thoughtful praises. But in the second chorus, he got so excited and grabbed the mic and jumped down from the bandstand and bent to it to sing a note. He had to touch his shoe tops and pull it all up to blow. And he blew so much he staggered from the effect and only recovered himself in time for the next long, slow note. "Music, play." He leaned back with his face into the ceiling, and Mike held at his fly. He shook, he swayed, then he leaned, almost falling with his face against the mic. "Make it dreamy for dancing." And he looked at the street outside with his lips curled in scorn. "While we go romancing." He staggered sideways. "Love's holiday." He shook his head with disgust and weariness at the whole world. "We'll make it seem." What would it make it seem? Everybody wanted Everybody wanted, everybody waited. He mourned, okay. The piano hit a chord. So baby, come on, just close your eyes. His mouth quivered. He looked at us, Neil and I, with an expression that seemed to say, hey now, what's this thing we're all doing in this sad, brown world? And then he came to an end of his song. And for this, there had to be elaborate preparations, during which time you could send all the messages to Garcia around the world 12 times. And what difference did it make to anybody? Because here we were dealing with the pit and the prune juice of poor beat life itself in the god-awful streets of man. So he said, and so he sang it. Close your, and blew it way up to the ceiling and through to the stars and on up, eyes, and staggered off the platform to brood. He sat in the corner with a bunch of boys, paid no attention to them. He looked down and he wept. He was great.